Japan, often poetically called the land of the rising sun. For people around the world today, that name evokes scenes of glowing neon cityscapes, Shinkansen trains slicing past moss-covered temples, clouds of cherry blossoms falling over quiet shrines, and hot springs steaming in misty mountain valleys. It is a place where cutting-edge technology, ancient ritual, and dramatic natural beauty coexist so effortlessly that visiting Japan once in a lifetime has become a dream for millions. Yet this open, inviting Japan we recognize now is a relatively recent chapter in a very long story. For more than 200 years, roughly from the 1600s to the 1800s, Japan quite literally shut itself off from the outside world. Harbors were sealed, sea routes guarded, and ordinary people were forbidden to leave the country. This era, called Sakoku, or the closed country, was not an age of decay but of intense inward focus. Culture flourished, the economy grew, and society became more layered and sophisticated than ever before. Many of the customs, art forms, and symbols we now think of as traditional Japan were born, refined, or perfected during this period of isolation. So, how did this island nation journey all the way from centuries of deliberate seclusion to becoming one of the most open, advanced, and influential societies on the planet? This is the story of Japan. The islands that make up present-day Japan have sheltered human communities for around 40,000 years. The earliest inhabitants came from mainland Asia, bringing more than just stone tools or weapons. They carried knowledge, how to cultivate crops, how to work metal, how to create permanent villages. From these scattered early settlements, the first organized political structures and primitive kingdoms slowly began to take shape. By the 3rd century AD, something transformative was underway in the southern part of the archipelago. A substantial region had gathered under a single center of power in the Yamato area. At its head stood a ruler we now refer to as the Emperor, the first outlines of an imperial institution that would, at least in name, endure for many centuries. From its earliest days, Japan's evolution was intertwined with the great civilizations across the sea. In 552, Buddhism arrived from the Korean peninsula, ushering in not just a new religion, but an entire universe of ideas, art, and philosophy. Then, in 1645, sweeping reforms known as the Taika reforms were introduced, deliberately reshaping Japan's political framework along the lines of the powerful Chinese imperial model, with a central court at its heart. Initially, that imperial court was rootless. Each time a new emperor ascended the throne, the capital shifted, wandering from one location to another like a moving camp of authority. That changed in 794, when Emperor Kanmu made a decisive move. He established a permanent capital at what we now call Kyoto. This act inaugurated the Heian period, an age of refined court culture and artistic brilliance that would last nearly 400 years. Over time, however, the court in Kyoto turned inward. Nobles became increasingly absorbed in elaborate ceremonies, poetry, and complex intrigues, while the practical work of governing a vast countryside slipped beyond their reach. As central authority weakened, power began to seep outward into the provinces, where local aristocrats and landholders gradually behaved more like autonomous rulers than distant servants of the throne. From this long, uneven shift emerged a new pattern, a feudal order in which real control over land and people was no longer concentrated in Kyoto, but was held by regional elites. Among these, powerful warrior families such as the Taira and Minamoto rose to dominance. Supported by their loyal bands of samurai, they were no longer satisfied to operate behind the scenes. They were ready to confront imperial power directly. In 1160, that tension erupted in the Heiji Rebellion, sparked by disputes over who should inherit the imperial throne. The conflict escalated into the Genpei War, 1180-1185, a brutal contest between the Taira and Minamoto that would reshape Japan's political landscape. In the end, it was the Minamoto clan, led by Minamoto no Yoritomo, that prevailed. Yoritomo did not simply resume the old arrangement of serving an all-powerful emperor. Instead, he founded a separate military government in Kamakura, far removed from the aristocratic circles of Kyoto. In 1192, he convinced Emperor Go-Toba to grant him the title of shogun, or great general. In reality, this made Yoritomo the effective ruler of the country, while the emperor's role became largely symbolic. Thus began the era of the shogunate, a system of military rule that would dominate Japanese politics for the next 7 centuries. But the samurai would soon face a challenge more formidable than any domestic rival. At the start of the 13th century, one of history's most fearsome empires turned its attention toward Japan. In 1265, Kublai Khan, ruler of the Mongol Empire, demanded that Japan submit as a vassal. His demands went unanswered. In response, he prepared for invasion. In 1274, Mongol forces landed on Kyushu, confronting a smaller but resolute force of samurai defenders. The invaders brought new weapons, unfamiliar tactics, and sheer numerical superiority. Yet, when the outcome seemed uncertain, the weather intervened. A violent typhoon swept through the region, ripping apart the Mongol fleet. Later, the Japanese would call this storm Kamikaze, the divine wind. A second invasion followed in 1281. Once again, vast Mongol armadas sailed toward Japan. Once again, a catastrophic typhoon struck, smashing ships and drowning soldiers. 2 invasions, 2 devastating storms. In Japanese memory, it felt as though the gods themselves had shielded the islands. However, these victories carried a heavy price. Mobilizing a massive defense strained the finances of the Kamakura shogunate to the breaking point. Many samurai, who had fought expecting reward in land or wealth, received nothing. Their anger and disappointment simmered. In 1333, Emperor Go launched an ambitious bid to restore genuine imperial authority. For a short time, he succeeded. And direct rule by the emperor returned, but this restoration was fragile and short-lived. Just 5 years later, in 1338, Go-Daigo was deposed by Ashikaga Takauji, a former ally who established a new shogunate based in Kyoto. Once more, real power shifted back to the hands of military rulers. Even then, the shogun's control was far from absolute. In practice, authority rested with regional daimyō, feudal lords who governed their territories with considerable independence. These lords struck deals, broke them, formed shifting alliances, and fought one another almost continuously in pursuit of greater power. In 1467, tensions over the succession of Shogun Ashikaga Yoshimasa burst into all-out war. This conflict, known as the Onin War, devastated Kyoto and shattered what remained of strong central rule. Japan fragmented into a mosaic of competing domains, each ruled by its own ambitious lord. The era that followed is remembered as the Sengoku period, the age of warring states. It was more than a century of near-constant warfare, but also a time of intense innovation in strategy, politics, and military organization. New figures emerged from the shadows: ninja, specialists in espionage, sabotage, and assassination. On the battlefield, armies were sometimes joined by sohei, warrior monks whose religious zeal was matched by their fighting skill. Then, in 1543, a very different kind of storm changed Japan's future. A Portuguese vessel, blown off course, landed on the small island of Tanegashima, south of Kyushu. Aboard were 3 Portuguese traders, the first known Europeans to reach Japan. They came not with conquest in mind, but with goods to trade. And among those goods were weapons that would transform Japanese warfare: European muskets. The Portuguese rapidly integrated Japan into their wider Indo-Pacific trade network. Once a year, a heavily laden vessel that the Japanese nicknamed the Black Ship would arrive, carrying textiles, sugar, news of distant lands, and, crucially, guns. For daimyo locked in brutal struggles across the country, these firearms were nothing short of revolutionary. By 1556, it's believed that more than 300,000 such weapons were in circulation in Japan, a staggering figure for the era. Along with guns, the Portuguese also brought Christianity. For some warlords, adopting the new faith came with immediate benefits: preferential access to firearms and, at times, direct military assistance. One of the most prominent to cooperate with them was Oda Nobunaga. Although he never converted, he fully embraced the new technology of gunpowder, deploying muskets and cannon in ways that gave him a decisive edge as he worked to unify Japan. But Nobunaga's rise ended abruptly. In 1582, he was betrayed and forced to commit suicide. His unfinished mission fell to one of his most gifted generals, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Hideyoshi's story reads almost like legend. Born into a peasant family, he climbed the ranks through talent, charisma, and unshakable determination, eventually becoming a samurai, then a daimyō, and finally the most powerful figure in the land. He brought the long era of competing warlords to a close, uniting the fractured domains into a single political entity for the first time in generations. Despite effectively ruling the entire country, Hideyoshi never assumed the title of shogun, likely because of his lowly origins. Instead, he took on the posts of Kanpaku, imperial regent, and Daijo Daijin, chancellor of the realm. He intended for his young son, Toyotomi Hideyori, to succeed him, and instructed 5 trusted lieutenants to safeguard the boy's future rule. However, when Hideyoshi died in 1598, old promises quickly crumbled. Japan's daimyo split into rival camps, those loyal to Hideyori and those rallying behind Tokugawa Ieyasu, a powerful lord who had once served Hideyoshi but harbored ambitions of his own. In 1600, their rivalry came to a head at the Battle of Sekigahara, a massive engagement often described as the showdown that determined Japan's fate. Tokugawa Ieyasu emerged victorious. In 1603, he was formally appointed shogun, establishing the Tokugawa shogunate, which would dominate Japanese politics for more than 2.5 centuries. This epoch is better known as the Edo period, named after Edo, today's Tokyo, where the shogunate set up its seat of power. When people picture old Japan, complete with samurai, geisha, tea houses, and bustling wooden streets, they are often imagining the world of Edo. Above all, the Edo period was an age of long peace. After generations of civil war, Japan was finally unified and relatively stable. In that quiet, culture and commerce blossomed. Small towns grew into thriving cities. Trade routes linked distant regions. Urban life flourished, giving rise to vibrant popular entertainment, new forms of storytelling, and iconic arts such as ukiyo-e woodblock prints. But the price of peace was tight control. The Tokugawa regime enforced strict social hierarchies and harsh penalties to deter rebellion. Christianity, viewed as a subversive foreign influence, was repressed with increasing severity and eventually outlawed altogether in 1638 after bloody uprisings in Christian communities. In 1639, under the third Tokugawa shogun, Ieyasu, a dramatic policy came into force: sakoku, the formal closing of the country. Japanese were forbidden to travel overseas or to construct ocean-going ships, and almost all foreigners were barred entry. Trade continued only in tightly controlled channels, with China and Korea, and with the Dutch, who were restricted to a tiny artificial island called Dejima in Nagasaki Harbor. Paradoxically, this seclusion coincided with impressive internal development. Throughout the 17th century, Japan grew wealthier and more connected internally. The population swelled to about 30 million. Networks of roads, relay stations, and schools were built, knitting the country together and pushing literacy rates upward. A sophisticated urbanized society emerged, with merchants, artisans, and townspeople forming a dynamic middle class. Yet by the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the system that had seemed so stable began to show serious cracks. The agricultural growth that had fueled earlier prosperity faltered. Catastrophic famines in the 1830s brought immense suffering, and the shogunate's faltering response bred anger and disillusionment. Meanwhile, even the walls of isolation could not entirely block foreign ideas. Through Dejima, Japanese scholars obtained books on Western science and technology. Collectively known as Rangaku or Dutch learning, they studied astronomy, medicine, and modern military science, quietly preparing Japan for the transformations to come. In 1853, those preparations were put to the test when isolation was broken in the most dramatic way imaginable. A flotilla of American warships under Commodore Matthew Perry steamed into Edo Bay. The sight of their dark iron hulls and smoking funnels was shocking to Japanese onlookers. The United States demanded that Japan open its ports to American vessels and trade, making it clear that refusal could lead to war. Recognizing that Japan's defenses were hopelessly outmatched, the Tokugawa shogunate agreed, signing treaties first with the US and later with other Western nations like Britain and Russia. After more than 200 years, Japan's doors were forced open. To many Japanese, especially samurai and leaders in the southern domains of Choshu and Satsuma, these agreements were deeply humiliating. Unequal treaties dictated tariffs and legal privileges. Foreigners walked Japanese streets seemingly above local law. Anger and frustration crystallized into a powerful slogan and movement: "Revere the emperor, expel the barbarians." In 1868, samurai from Choshu and Satsuma allied and moved decisively. They persuaded the young Emperor Meiji to issue a proclamation ending the Tokugawa shogunate. Troops loyal to the emperor marched on Edo in what came to be known as the Boshin War. The Tokugawa regime fell, and imperial authority was formally restored. The following year, in 1869, the imperial court relocated to Edo. The city received a new name: Tokyo, the eastern capital. This signaled the start of the Meiji Restoration, a watershed moment in both Japanese and world history. With remarkable speed and determination, Japan launched a national project of modernization. Under Meiji leadership, rail lines were laid down, telegraph cables stretched across the islands, and a universal school system was introduced. The old ban on Christianity was lifted. New legal codes were drafted, influenced heavily by European models. The government hired hundreds of foreign specialists from Britain, France, Germany, the United States, and beyond to advise on everything from industrial production and finance to law and education. Special emphasis was placed on building a modern army and navy, organized, armed, and trained according to the latest Western doctrines. In 1877, this modern army was sent to put down the Satsuma Rebellion, led by former samurai who opposed the changes that had eroded their traditional status. Its defeat was both a military and symbolic end to the age of the samurai. With its new power, Japan began to expand outward. After consolidating control over Hokkaido and annexing the Ryukyu Islands, it turned toward China and Korea. In the First Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895, Japan's modern forces overwhelmed Qing China, leading to the annexation of Taiwan. In 1902, Japan entered a landmark military alliance with Britain, aimed at countering Russia's growing influence in East Asia. Tensions with Russia eventually erupted into the Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905. To the astonishment of much of the Western world, Japan won. Victories at the Yalu River and the Battle of Tsushima announced that an Asian power had, for the first time in the modern era, defeated a major European empire. By 1910, Japan had formally annexed Korea, solidifying its status as the preeminent power in East Asia. During World War I, Japan fought on the side of the Allies, capturing German-held territories in the Pacific and parts of China. At the peace conference in Versailles, Japan sat among the victors and joined the League of Nations, enjoying a period of relative international prestige. Yet beneath the surface, forces were gathering that would lead Japan down a darker path. In the interwar years, militarism and intense nationalism gained influence. Within the armed forces, many officers became convinced that Japan was destined to lead and dominate Asia. This belief justified increasingly aggressive expansion. In 1937, Japan broadened its conflict in China into a full-scale war, the Second Sino-Japanese War. Japanese troops seized vast territories on the mainland, but their conduct, marked by atrocities and brutality, sparked global outrage and deepened mistrust. The United States, alarmed by Japan's actions, imposed sweeping economic sanctions, restricting vital imports such as oil and steel. Japan's leaders, unwilling to abandon their ambitions yet squeezed by shortages, felt trapped. In 1940, Japan formalized its alignment with Germany and Italy by signing the Tripartite Pact, joining the Axis powers. It expanded further into Southeast Asia, moving into territories claimed by Britain, the Netherlands, and France. Finally, on December 7, 1941, Japan chose a desperate course of action. Under Prime Minister and General Hideki Tojo, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched a surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The plan was to deliver a crippling blow that would keep the United States at bay while Japan consolidated its Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. Instead, the attack united American public opinion and brought the U.S. fully into World War II. The Pacific became a vast battleground. Japanese forces fought across the Philippines, Malaya, Hong Kong, Singapore, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies, but over time, the balance of power shifted. The Allies, led by the United States, adopted an island-hopping strategy, capturing key islands and turning them into air bases for bombing campaigns against Japan's home islands. Fierce battles at places like Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa cost hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. By 1945, American planners concluded that a full-scale invasion of Japan would result in unimaginable casualties. Seeking a way to end the war quickly, they turned to a new and horrifying weapon. On August 6th and 9th, 1945, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The explosions instantly obliterated large parts of both cities, killing well over 100,000 people and leaving many more to suffer from burns and radiation. On August 14th, Japan's decision to surrender was communicated to the Allies. The following day, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese people by radio. For most citizens, it was the first time they had ever heard their emperor's voice. In careful, solemn words, he told them that the war had ended. Japan's long era of imperial expansion and conflict had come to a close. In the aftermath, Japan fell under Allied occupation, led by General Douglas MacArthur. The armed forces were dismantled. A new democratic constitution was drafted and adopted. While Emperor Hirohito remained on the throne, he was required to renounce any claim to divine status, dismantling a core feature of the state Shinto ideology. Guided by Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida, Japan adopted a new national strategy. It would prioritize economic recovery and growth over military power. Under the protective umbrella of American security, Japan directed its energy toward rebuilding factories, infrastructure, and cities. By 1951, Japan's economy had already surpassed its pre-war output. By 1968, it had become the world's second-largest capitalist economy. In the decades that followed, brands such as Toyota, Sony, and Panasonic came to symbolize reliability, innovation, and cutting-edge technology. From cars and cameras to televisions and game consoles, products labeled "Made in Japan" reached households across the globe. Out of the ashes of war, a transformed Japan rose, a country of high-speed trains and tranquil tea ceremonies, of advanced robotics and centuries-old festivals. Today, Japan consistently ranks among the world leaders in economic strength, technological advancement, education, and life expectancy. The engine behind this transformation was not magic, but the persistence, discipline, and resilience of the Japanese people. After enduring some of the most harrowing experiences of the 20th century, they chose to rebuild on foundations of peace, cooperation, and shared prosperity. And perhaps the most striking part of Japan's journey is this: a nation that once sealed itself off from the world, later fought bitter wars against it, has finally reopened its doors, this time carrying not swords and warships, but ideas, culture, and technology that continue to influence and inspire the world today.